It's fantastic that anything as vast and incomprehensible as London should evoke such personal responses. Dear damned distracting town, Alexander Pope called it. London is a modern Babylon, said Disraeli. That monstrous tuberosity of civilized life, that's Carlyle, of course. We take London on the chin, hate it, love it. Mostly hate it, to judge by the insults these writers have heaped on it. But London also collected at least one compliment, pretty enough for a poet's mistress. William Dunbar's, "London, thou art the flower of cities all." But if Dunbar could see it now, he would find it a pretty overblown blossom. The original bud, the square mile we call the city, is still there, but only 4,000 of the almost 9 million people who think of themselves as Londoners still live in it. Every weekday morning, almost 2 million out of the 9 scramble for buses or sprint the last 100 yards up the station approach to pack themselves into trains that leave the outposts of suburbia, the huge sprawl of half town, half country that makes up Greater London. Outposts like Orpington, and from there they worm their way in through 15 to 20 miles of tangled railways until they arrive at the centre, the daily agony of the commuter caught up in the giant embrace of London. It's the agony of commuters in every great city, but worse in London, where the image of the original compactness still persists. At the centre, the fortunate few who still live there are wondering whether to have their breakfast boiled or fried before they go sauntering off to work, more or less at their leisure. And in the evening, while they return home at ease, the 2 million-odd commuters are squaring up to the ordeal of fighting their way back home. Their destinations could be places like Watford, as far away on the other side of London as is Orpington. For the Great Wen, as Cobbett rudely called it, is now some 40 miles across. It's too big. It's hopelessly, incomprehensibly too big. But it's always been too big. Even while Dunbar was garlanding London with compliments, Elizabeth I was trying to prohibit new building outside the walls by Act of Parliament. Like all purely restrictive legislation, this had no lasting effect. Within a couple of decades, the Stuart kings were trying to order London back within bounds, and to equally little avail. You can't cut a growing city down to size by law. You can't behead it or confine it in the Tower. The human desires and needs that drive men into cities are not to be blocked by royal decree. When frustrated by king or parliament, or the stupidity of its own civic legislation, London has found other ways of growing. The most characteristic of these, the one that's really made London what it is, works by reaching out and capturing independent hamlets and villages. One after another, pretty townships and squalid shack towns have been grabbed and absorbed in London. Some have been murdered or obliterated, but most have come through as recognisable places, and many have retained their village character to this day in places like Highgate, Hampstead or Roehampton. To live in a London village is still one of the high ambitions of Londoners. This habit of capturing villages long before the main tide of building had reached them gave London its unique pattern on the ground. Compared with other capitals, it is thin and patchy, constantly being interrupted by parks, heaths, marshes, and other miscellaneous bits of greenery that have been preserved by royal decree, by civic authorities, or by the sheer cussedness of sundry individuals who hang on to their own bits of green, sometimes sizable bits, like this 2-acre garden in Chelsea, in the teeth of all the blandishments of developers or the bullying of local authorities. London's strength and London's weakness lies in its being a pattern of accidents. No great planner seized upon London at some crucial point in its growth and gave it a grand design. Most of the talent in planning seems to have gone into picturesque landscaping that accords ill with the idea of a capital city, a centre of imperial power. Most of London's great buildings are pretty undistinguished. Its pomp and its circumstance more often lies in a person or ceremony than in the architecture. The heart of empire is neither convincingly grand nor effectively monumental. Indeed, the only great palace, and it's no longer used as a palace, that answers worthily to the description is not in the heart, but miles away down the Thames at Greenwich. Typically, London has only one great processional way, and that is not really long enough to marshal a procession that would pass muster in Paris or Washington. Equally typically, it has only one great public square where you can stage a decent political demonstration in what is now the approved manner, with banners and scuffles and all the rest of it. The rest of London's squares are private islands of trees and lawns and flowers, and you just can't demonstrate with your banner caught up in a flowering cherry and your feet in a bed of begonias. It is these private squares that are the real clue to what London is all about. They are neither public nor political. They were created for the private enjoyment of the householders in the terraces around them. London was built around private citizens. It has managed to tolerate the presence of King and Parliament, but neither has ever dominated it. London is the unique city, not only because it is thin on the ground, but because it is also a capital built to live in. This residential emphasis has dominated the growth and character of London, and for much of its history, it was London's chief glory. From the modest squares around the British Museum to the nearby grandeur of Regent's Park, it is the residences of the solid middle citizenry that establish the ideal. And it is an ideal that Regent's Park realizes with a classical flourish denied even to the residences of royalty. The grand palatial facades are made up of terrace houses, and the handsome landscape is not a royal prerogative, it's the front garden. And this, and things like it, are London's great and unique contribution to European town planning. These squares and terraces are where Londoners lived. The blue plaques put up by the London County Council commemorate residence. Not that a man was born or worked here, but that he lived here. And lived here in a house. Whether it looked like it or not, the Londoner's house was a separate piece of property standing on its own piece of ground. He entered his own front door on ground level and spent the rest of the time running up and down stairs, like birds flitting from perch to perch, said an exhausted foreigner in the 18th century. The word flat was unknown in London before the 1860s. The tall, narrow terrace house was London's trademark. Its sudden appearance in open country was a sure sign that the nearest village had just been captured by the metropolis. There are areas, even in the inner suburbs, where terraces and houses that are shown on early records can still be identified, where original buildings and rights of way still survive. The thin, patchy expansion of the thin, patchy metropolis can still be traced, but in the end, it was to be London's undoing. The idea of giving every citizen his own house on his own piece of ground with greenery became dynamite as soon as every citizen came to mean every Tom, Dick or nobody with a vote. That greatest of all nobodies in Victorian literature, Mr. Pooter, the hero of the Grossmith's Diary of a Nobody, is typical of the little men who began to find that machine-age prosperity was making it possible for them to work in town, but to live in a village community round some landmark like a pub. Wherever land was cheap and accessible, primly respectable little terraces began to go up. But now the communal square of the Georgian period was being replaced by the private garden and the private rituals of cultivating it. And as I said, this kind of green spread was town planning dynamite. When that dynamite exploded, it was triggered by a harmless-looking railway system that turned the spread of London into an ugly, sprawling, corrupting flood. The London Underground was the world's first. It celebrated its centenary earlier this year. It started as the simple loop of the inner circle, relieving pressure on surface transport by planting a station wherever it crossed, say, Bridge Street, Westminster, or any other important artery. This was a very proper tactic while the underground remained within the area that was already built up and needed relief. But as it pushed out into the open country, this business of planting a station where you hit a main road made less and less sense, because most of these intersections were in the middle of nowhere. So what happened when you built a station and a traffic roundabout at some map reference out in the sticks and called it Hendon Central? This is what happened. In just 5 years, the speculative builders moved in and buried the surrounding fields in bulk housing by the yard. Where earlier expansion had taken place around the nucleus provided by an existing village after London had captured it, around a place with social and human attributes, the new housing was dumped in the undifferentiated spaces between villages, and all it had for a social focus was usually a traffic roundabout. It happened in Hendon, it happened across the other side of London at Morton, places that were once as different as being 20 miles apart on opposite sides of the Thames could make them, but now reduced to equality as vassals of Metroland, the great suburban empire of the underground. The boss of that empire, the late Frank Pick, was something of a culture hero in the 30s, but we now begin to recognize him as one of the destroyers of London, a man who consciously manipulated suburban development and reduced the citizens to traffic statistics. When he decided to extend the line beyond Edgware, he is reported to have told an interviewer, "I'm going to move 500,000 of the buggers out here," and he was as good as his word. This is what Edgware looked like after he had finished with it, another province of bulk suburbia and ribbon development, the great nowhere of fake half-timbering that rings London on all its most desirable sides. In this suburban ring, nearly a third of all Londoners now live, the dormitory suburbs where hardly a soul stirs on the streets all day. It is the true twilight zone of London, neither city nor country, village nor town, coming briefly alive when the commuters flock away to central London or flock back to their illusions of gracious living. For this is the land of illusion. Illusion that can be as ludicrous as an attempt to create a fragment of gay Paris on top of a shed by the railway, but ultimately the tragic illusion that this is any kind of way to live in a great city, that to live like this is to be a Londoner in anything but the name. This illusion, or something like it, was shared by people who ought to have known better. The London County Council, for instance, the very opposite of a speculative builder, was dumping the working classes into out-county estates such as Becontree. They differed from Metroland only in being located in unfashionable areas. It is still formless, inorganic sprawl. The pattern of accidents, the mosaic of small decisions that had once been London's glory were now becoming its downfall. The decisions were no longer small. The accidents were achieving the proportions of national disasters. But it was human decisions that were building up to this disaster, and human decisions could arrest the process. The first counterattack was no improvement on the unsuccessful legislation of Queen Elizabeth and the Stuarts. In 1948, the Green Belt was decreed in an attempt to confine London's middle-age spread in a corset of land where further building would be prohibited. But beyond the Green Belt, in the greatest planning effort ever made by a nation for its capital, Britain gave London the new towns to expand into. Officially, these satellite cities were intended to be places with an independent life of their own. High intentions. It hasn't altogether worked out like that. Lost in the maze of statistics, so many persons to the acre, to the neighborhood, and so on, the creators of the new towns made them at first look uncommonly like the old suburbs and housing estates. Perhaps worse, because they didn't even have traffic intersections for hearts. But now, at last, like Harlow, they are growing shopping centres, public squares, and the rest of the sort of social facilities that make a place live as a town or city, though even now their hearts tend to go dead the moment the shops shut in the evening. But they still represent London's residential ideal run riot, and their crowning achievement is to have produced housing that looks as if it might be the modern equivalent of London's traditional squares and terraces. But what has it really got to do with London? These towns were set up by national policy. They are 30 miles or so away from the centre, and they're supposed not to be suburbs, but to have these independent lives of their own. But it seems that London has responded in the same traditional way. Once more, it has reached out and captured these outlying townships. It makes it look almost as if they were built specially for that purpose. For without London, they would never have come into existence. Their populations are mostly Londoners by origin, and the great metropolis is still so powerful a magnet that it leaves no alternative but definite attraction or equally definite repulsion.
I would hate to sever my links entirely with London, and I enjoy working in London and living here.
Commuting every day, and I enjoy that.
I don't think I would go back to live in London, no, but I'd like to be near London.
I don't spend any time in London, apart from the time I spend at work, that is.
I'd rather work in London than in Harlow because I like to get away. Makes a change, makes a break.
It's a sad thing, I think, that people should be travelling in such numbers between Harlow and London, because the object of the new towns was to give people more time to live in.
People in the new towns are uncertain Londoners, but they remain Londoners. Nevertheless, they are really at the maximum distance at which London is still psychologically real. Modern legislation has moved them out of London. Modern transport makes it possible for them to get back in again. But there is a limit to how far this process can go. Yet the next wave of legislation is to move Londoners out to the so-called expanded towns that are 100 miles or so from the centre of London. What kind of Londoner will the inhabitants of expanded towns like Thetford be? No kind at all. If they feel like Londoners, they will feel like exiles, not only because of the sheer distance, but chiefly because they are cut off from the rich fullness of life in the mammoth city. When Dr. Johnson said that the man who is tired of London is tired of life, he meant the sheer quantity and variety of everything, all that life can afford. For some people, the richness is too much. For most of this century, planners and visionaries have denounced London as congested, inhuman, restless, wasteful. But the margin between fullness and congestion is very slight. Often it is only in the eye of the beholder. London can be like a party where there are just a couple of guests too many, a permanent scrum round the bar, the buffet like a pig trough. People you want to talk to are always on the other side of the room. But most of the time, London can be a party that really swings.
London is the hub of England. Everything goes on here, centres here.
London's just an existence. It's a place to work in. It doesn't mean anything else to me.
In London, I can't use a car because every time I bring it up, I get fined. £2.
Oh, no, I wouldn't like to live in London. I come here to watch the netball, and the girls as well, of course.
Well, personally, I find it rather amusing. It's terribly British.
I don't mind the rush hour.
I don't think I'd care to live right in the centre because of the lack of fresh air and green spaces.
It's dirty.
A blessed oasis.
Busy.
It's inconvenient.
I simply love it. It's foggy. Lovely scenery.
One of the real troubles with London is that it's like a party where people won't spread themselves properly. Infuriatingly, they get clustered in doorways and leave whole rooms deserted. Many things in London could work better if the place was better organised. We complain, for instance, that the city is choking for lack of space. That there's bags of space in the central areas for 16 hours out of the 24 in every day, and for 2 whole days at every weekend. Streets, parking spaces, transport, buildings that are used only from 9 till 5 and Monday till Friday. The next attempts to deal with the problems of the mammoth city could well begin by recolonising its heart. Urban renewal, is not yet a familiar concept in Britain, but it will have to be. In practice, it often means urban surgery. So far, the only kind of urban renewal that is understood by Londoners is slum clearance. But this, however necessary, has nearly always operated destructively, taking life away from central areas and leaving a kind of vacuum behind. Until recently, even the most admired housing developments were just further contributions to the sprawling suburbs. Even the Roehampton estate, internationally famous, handsomely designed, beautifully landscaped and genuinely enjoyed by its inhabitants.
The flats and masonettes are so compact and neat and easy to keep clean.
But we find that it's ideal, especially for children.
You can get some biscuits and a bottle of lemonade and say, well, go on up the Common or down Richmond Park. But it's the young children. There's nowhere where you can put them safely while you're indoors getting on with work.
But Roehampton seems to be the point where the town planning tide turned. Sooner or later, there had to be a reaction, a return to the centre, to the old heart of London. Much of that heart is in bad shape. Worn-out buildings, bomb damage, planning that never deserved to be called planning, derelict industries and urban blight. Slum clearance can be the urban renewer's bridgehead into such districts, as at St Anne's Limehouse in the most heavily bombed area of the East End, but also in the shadow of one of Hawksmoor's noblest baroque churches. There, the London County Council has in mind something like a complete transformation. Not merely new and better housing, but a more effective organisation of what is on the ground, so that waste space becomes usable open spaces. Nothing grandiose, no Stalin LA stuff, but something that runs on in London's native traditions of orderly, close-packed housing in one place, open greenery in another, the patchy, hit-and-miss pattern that makes it the unique city. Yet the renewed neighbourhood, remember, butts up hard against the commerce and industry of Dockland. It offers the chance of work almost on the doorstep and the spectacle of a great port in action. But at St Anne's, you can come in out of the bustle and business. You can turn your back on the spectacle. These relatively quiet interior spaces are the kind of benefit that properly thought out urban renewal can offer, and mere slum clearance usually cannot. Or at any rate, not in such direct confrontation with the banquet of London. It's almost the best of both worlds. But building back into the existing heart of the city brings its problems. It's one thing to put up tower blocks and lay out brand new playgrounds in areas that have been razed to the ground, but it's something else again where there's any bit of the previous London that is worth preserving. These are new, but they are new backs tacked onto existing Victorian terraces that could be preserved because they were still structurally sound and were worth the preservation because they're good, urban, London-style housing. Preservation, of course, is one of London's trickiest problems. Even if it were physically, politically, economically possible to bulldoze the whole sprawling mass flat, there would be psychological and aesthetic reasons for keeping some of its buildings. Not just the great monuments, but much of the humbler stuff that is part of the face of London. It's not sentimentality either. Park Crescent is being laboriously put back just as it was, but over a new concrete frame, not because it's old, but because it is part of John Nash's great design for Regent's Park, a design that cannot be altered or dismembered. But there is misplaced sentimentality about Georgian terraces. Mistaking the style of architecture for the style of living, fashionable people have created areas of awful chocolate box gentility. Yet mugs who buy this sort of property at fancy prices are on the right track. Compact living near the centre is the way to get the best out of London, as well as a way to beat its mammoth sprawl. The key is the way of stacking men on the ground. We can't give every man his own front door nowadays because there are too many of them, but we can still offer Londoners quiet gardens and places where it's safe for kids to play, even if the playing lies outside the provisions of the bylaws. Every bit of greenery that rejoiced the eyes of our Georgian forebears can do the same for us today. Every square yard of paved surface can work for us again. You don't have to have great architecture to make a great place to live. That is London's unique lesson. But Londoners could learn to be grateful that so much of the new architecture has been as good as this is. In the old London and in the new, the vital thing is always the handling of the pedestrians. If there is something that is worth fighting for in the heart of London, something that is worth keeping even when we knock down the buildings, it is the network of pedestrian communications and squares to stroll in, to sit in, just stand about in. This pedestrian network is the common denominator of all great European cities. You might say it's the basis of European civilization. But each individual city has its own style of walking, so to speak. On the boulevards of Paris, it is a parade on a grand scale. But in London, it remains an obstinately medieval mixture, a sort of primitive democracy of residence and commerce, a sort of calculated chaos that is part of the rich banquet of London. It's worth keeping and enhancing, not because it's medieval, but because it is London. And if we're going to keep it, then our urban renewal experts are going to have to find a way of keeping it alive, even under the apparently hostile conditions of motorized traffic systems. The best offer we have to date is to keep it not under that system, but literally above it. The high-level pedestrian terraces and the subterranean car parks along London Wall are our most extensive effort to date in dealing with the growing problems posed by the crush of cars and in creating a complete second city for foot passengers, raised a couple of stories above the world of wheels, made independent of the street pattern below by providing bridges and other connections that make it never necessary to come down to street level and fight your way through the traffic. The idea is not new. It's been proposed before in London, but it just hasn't caught on. I suppose it's that same feet on the ground, earthbound attitude that has made us hostile for so long to flats. But Londoners are moving into flats for all that.
I particularly like living high.
Well, I think we've got everything here on a city estate that you could possibly have anywhere. Even my children love it here. They've got plenty of space.
And it's very quiet in the city. On a Sunday, it's like being on an island.
She's right. It's an island in the silent wastes of a deserted city, a place as remote on Saturday and Sunday as the pleasures of the green belt are on the 5 working days of the week. But are these green pleasures so remote? Nearly 1 million of London's long-haul commuters pass almost within sight and smell of scenes like this every working day of the week, too jam-packed into their trains to be able to appreciate them. The mammoth city dies at the centre and loses itself at the fringes, simply because centre and fringe have lost contact with one another. It's too late now to try and roll back the frontiers of London, but psychologically we can perhaps get back closer to the heart. Not all the 9 million can hope to be born within the shadow of St. Paul's, but many more of them could, and could come to see London anew, not perhaps as Dunbar's flower, but at least as a city crowned with green and inhabited not by statistics, but by people.